We're going to turn our attention now to the Great Plague, and this is an event that relates, as you may have guessed, to the disease that they called the plague. Now, this happens in 1665. And long story short, it's when the plague hits London, kills about 100,000 people in London and also thousands of people across the country. Now, it's not to be confused with another event regarding the plague, which is the Black Death. So try not to get these muddled up. The Black Death happens in 1348, and that's when the plague first comes to Britain. The Great Plague is over 300 years later, and that's quite useful for us in terms of looking for examples of change in continuity. However, it's worth saying that the plague never really goes away. After the Black Death, it pops up once every couple of decades, really, every 10 or 20 years. Historians estimate that there were 20 outbreaks of the plague between the Black Death and 1500, and then a further 8 outbreaks between 1500 and 1670. After 1500, there are 2 particularly bad outbreaks in the 1640s and 50s, and then also in the 1590s and early 1600s. It can also hit particular towns very hard. So if we have a look at Bristol, for example, Bristol had outbreaks in 1597 and 1603 and 1637 and 1643 and 1650. Newcastle has a really bad attack of the plague in the year 1636. I'm going to take this down here and then take it to the side. So in 1636, Newcastle loses an estimated 47% of its population, which at the time was about 12,000 people strong. If you get the chance, an eyewitness called Ralph Taylor wrote an eyewitness account of that summer in Newcastle, so that's worth looking up. York as well, here it is. York had a particularly bad outbreak in 1604 and lost 30% of its population in 1604. So every so often the plague comes back, and we can see from these figures that it was carrying off sometimes thousands of people at a time and a sizable chunk of populations. It would tend to start in the spring or the summer, and although it could attack villages, the plague tended to be in towns, and we think this is because towns were so unhygienic. Now, one reason why the plague is scary is because of this. It's because it's extensive. It's because it turns up and kills thousands of people and then might turn up again. So remember with the plague that it's extensive. It's also really scary because it's painful and disfiguring. And just to really recap what the plague, really quickly recap even, what the plague involved, there was pneumonic plague, where it attacked the lungs, and that would make people's breath contagious, so it could be spread by droplets when they coughed or sneezed, and it also made them cough up blood before they died. There's another kind of plague called septicemic plague, where the plague causes blood poisoning, and that would make people's fingers and toes and sometimes their nose go black and rotten. And then finally, there's the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague is by and large what people tend to get in the Great Plague, and we're fairly clear about this. And that was caused by the fleas on rats. And in terms of symptoms, Apparently, the place where the flea bit would sort of turn blackish and swell up. The victim would then get very cold. They would then develop big swellings around their lymph nodes, so maybe in their armpits or their neck or their groin. These are called buboes. They would develop a fever, and as they had thermometers by then, they could measure it, and we know that the fevers could sometimes be more than 40 degrees Celsius, so really high fevers and headaches and vomiting. And blisters and carbuncles on the skin. And they might develop sort of blackish, purplish, reddish patches under the skin as well, where they started bleeding under the skin. And eventually the heart and kidneys would begin to fail, and death usually came in about 5 days. So bubonic plague was a really, really unpleasant experience. People died in agony. And it was a really unpleasant disease. Now, the other reason why the plague is so scary to people is because it's unknown. And when we have a look at the causes that people were blaming the plague on, or the causes on which people were blaming the plague, get my grammar right, then we can see they didn't really change very much from medieval times. So, as with medieval times, people tended to believe that the plague was either caused by God as a punishment, or by bad smells that we call miasma. More than one miasma is called miasmata. Or sometimes they believed that it was caused by planets and the movement of the planets and astrology, effectively. So that was another explanation that people had. What we see by the 1600s is that people are starting to put these explanations together in a little story. So, they might say that God has caused the movement of planets to raise miasma on the earth. But effectively, it's the same reasons that they've always had. They also sometimes blame beggars at the time who were called vagabonds. There were a lot of them because it wasn't a very economically stable time in Britain. A lot of people were homeless and very poor. They might blame foreigners as well. So there are accounts of people attacking vagabonds and foreigners and blaming them for bringing the plague. They believed that miasma as well could be carried in people's clothes, and it could also be carried by cats and dogs in their fur. Finally, they have some ideas that the plague is a communicable disease and it can be passed from person to person. The problem is they don't really have any understanding of how or why. What they don't have is any idea about the rats and the fleas. So they do kind of understand that the plague might be able to pass from person to person, but they don't really understand very much about that at all. Now, from this, we can look at their treatments and their preventions. We don't actually know all that much about the way that they treated the plague, because when people had the plague, they tended to be locked up in their houses, and they wouldn't really be very interested in keeping a record of it. But from what we know, there is, because it might be caused by God being angry with people, there is the usual method of praying for deliverance. And people do. Now, when the Black Death hit, England was a Roman Catholic country. When the Great Plague happens, England is Protestant, and the Protestants don't really approve of all the theatrics that the Roman Catholics used to have alongside this. So with the Protestants, they don't wear hair shirts, they don't walk barefoot, they don't self-flagellate, but the government does proclaim that Sundays are public days of prayer and fasting. Remember, fasting is not eating, to show God how sorry you are. So the government did proclaim public days of prayer and fasting, and just generally trying to work out what your sins were and stopping doing them. Now, the old preventions of bleeding and also purging are still sometimes used. There's also a lot of herbal remedies. And there's a variety of these. Apothecaries, there's that word. Apothecaries might recommend any variety of herbal mixtures. They might advise people to use mint or things like rosemary or sugar or nutmeg. There's also a thriving trade for quacks who claim to have created cures or preventions and herbal remedies that will cure or prevent the plague. One very famous one is called theriac. It's also known as London treacle. And that was a mixture of various spices and honey and perhaps opium as well. So that was being sold as people desperately tried to find a solution. People might use things like spells and charms. Apparently it was really popular to have the word abracadabra in the shape of a triangle as a sort of charm against getting the plague. Another possible prevention, and I have absolutely no idea how to draw this, so I'm not doing, some people believe that syphilis, if you got syphilis, you were safe from the plague, because syphilis and the plague both had sores as one of their symptoms. So some people would go out and actively try and contract syphilis, which was also known as the Great Pox. But this is an STD. So they would basically go around and try and catch an STD in the way that you catch STDs. As well as this, generally physicians and various other medics would advise people with the plague to use thick woolly blankets and to sit by a very hot fire and to try and sweat it out. So, do that in yellow. They might advise a diet that is really high in garlic, because that was believed to help people fight the plague. So they might advise dietary, have dietary suggestions. There's also, remember, a really strong belief at this time in the theory of transference, and this is where you can pass a disease on to an item or an animal. So one popular remedy was to shave a chicken's bottom and strap the live chicken to your bubo, because the idea is that the plague goes into the chicken and leaves you alone. So that was sometimes touted as a suggestion. There were other ones where you cut pigeons in half and strap those to the buboes. People might try and cut open the buboes. However, as far as I can gather, buboes were a bit like spots, and if you've ever tried to squeeze a spot before it was ready, you'll know that it's not necessarily a very good idea. So they might also try to apply poultices to buboes to get them ready, because people had a better chance of survival if the bubo opened and the black pus inside came out. So overall, when we look at the preventions and the treatments for the plague in 1665, they haven't changed all that much, really, since 1348.